What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the games I reviewed in 2024 that I found to be disappointing for one reason or another, because when you review as many games as I do, some of them are bound to be less than impressive, frankly. Now, that said, just because I found these games disappointing doesn't mean that they're completely devoid of any use case, or, of course, simply personal preference. I know for a fact some people will like games that I did not, including, of course, the one at the very top spot. I think that will probably be the most contentious one, but another part of this is always expectations as well. So oftentimes your expectations going into a title will, of course, shape what you expect from it. I find this especially true with sequels where you've kind of already got an idea of what a game is, and if it fails to live up to that, while also simultaneously expanding what that game is, you're likely going to run into issues as a developer. At least in terms of the game's reception, I mean. Which is in no small part why I was disappointed with the game in the top spot. But with that out of the way, let's actually dive into this and talk about some of these titles. Now, first up on the list, we have Outcast A New Beginning. This is a follow-up to a cult classic from back in the day, one of the earlier titles to do like a big third-person open world. And knowing its place in history, I was excited to jump into this one and try it out. And unfortunately, most of what I found was a pretty traditional open-world action-adventure, if anything, which meant while that original title was pretty groundbreaking, this one was mostly just more of the same. And what really didn't help it along is that it was clearly more of a AA venture with AAA pricing. Now, somewhat recently, actually, back in October, they reduced the base price of the game down from $60 to $40, which is where I think it should have been to begin with. So that does alleviate one of the core issues I had with it, was just that it was simply too expensive for what it was. But even going beyond that, it's just a very safe game that doesn't take a lot of risks or creative liberty and mostly just tries to build on what was already established with that original game. And while parts of it were certainly fun, don't get me wrong, I just walked away from it with the feeling that I have played this game many times over in various forms, which is why I found it to be underwhelming. Now, moving on from there, we then have a Souls-like called Deathbound. So Deathbound was trying to do a few interesting things with swapping out builds and stuff and characters on the fly, but ultimately I found that I just didn't really enjoy the core mechanic of what it was trying to do, despite generally enjoying a lot of Souls-likes that I have played. But the primary problem with this one for me is that in combat, as you take damage, your health goes down, which means your stamina goes down. But that happens on a per morph basis, so each one of the characters you can morph into with a playstyle gets affected by this. And while that wouldn't be bad in and of itself, when you combine that with the way the game handles healing, which is that in order to heal the character you are currently playing, it takes health away from the other three that you are not, you're technically losing health every time you heal, which did not feel fun to me at all. Now, I have found that generally people who play this enjoy it a bit more than I did, but when you combine the problems with the core mechanics and just general problems with the genre that it tends to have, like lock-on and the camera issues that tend to be prevalent here, I just walked away from this experience not having really enjoyed it much at all. And given how prevalent the genre has become over the last few years, where we get Souls-likes all the time, spending time with one I just didn't enjoy, the very core of what it was trying to do, didn't make a lot of sense to me, which is why I ultimately gave this one a do not recommend. Now, third up on our list here, we have Broken Roads. Broken Roads is a CRPG that released earlier this year back in April, and while I think it's alright for the most part, ultimately I found it a little underwhelming. Not least of which because its main draw, its interesting morality system where it focuses on like worldview and how you respond to people, kind of just feels like a very run-of-the-mill morality system where you lock into a particular type of character, one of the game's different moralities basically, which then leads to different outcomes throughout the game. And that combined with combat that is just okay and some continuity problems no less when the game initially launched. And I ultimately felt pretty underwhelmed by the whole thing. Now, I do think if you're going to play this game multiple times, you can have a pretty good time with it just to see all the different options and how things can play out. But seeing as that is not most people, it becomes a bit more difficult to recommend it outside of that one specific time, or if you just really, really love CRPGs like myself. Now, luckily, since the game has launched, it did receive a whole bunch of patches to fix things up and whatnot, but it really doesn't change that combat feels very samey pretty much everywhere. Results in a game that, while again not bad, is simply outclassed on most everything it tries to do by other games in the genre. So while I do think it's worth playing if you love CRPGs, reality is there's just so many other games that do essentially the same thing that I would recommend to you first before we got to this one, is really where the problem is, because the things that are attempting to be unique and set this apart ultimately don't feel super well fleshed out. Now, on the other hand though, this game is set in a post-apocalyptic Western Australia, which has a lot of unique things going for it that I think could be appealing to a lot of people just to see that part. But otherwise, honestly, I was just kind of hoping for more. And unless you plan on playing this, 3-4 times, which you're likely not going to know until you actually play it to begin with, it becomes difficult to recommend to most people. But moving right along, second to last, we then have Vessel of Hatred. So this one is not a full game release really, but an expansion to Diablo 4 mostly. And my disappointment here was very specifically about the story of it, which, sure, it's probably not the reason most people play these ARPGs. And I do think Vessel of Hatred adds some interesting things to the overall game and, the live aspect of it. But the main reason that I am throwing it on this list, despite it being an expansion more than a proper game release, which means I normally wouldn't have added it to a list like this, but the reason I wanted to talk about it here is simply because the story in particular was a real letdown for me. So they set up Mephisto going to the Kurast jungle and trying to corrupt Niriel and everything, and ultimately, right as that story begins to feel like it's getting off the ground, suddenly the expansion's over, the main story of it is done, and they're clearly just setting up another expansion, and I found that extremely annoying. Not least of which because Diablo is a franchise that I really enjoy in terms of its lore and its story, which, again, I know that's not the reason a ton of people play these, but I really love it. And having to see that materialized via a game with a business model that I am not a fan of at all is unfortunate, and it's disappointing for me to see, which is why I decided to go ahead and throw it on this particular video. But that does bring me to, honestly, my much bigger disappointment of the year, and by far the game I was the most disappointed with, which turned out to be Dragon's Dogma 2. Now, I will say, if you've never played the original Dragon's Dogma, I think Dragon's Dogma 2 will actually probably be more enjoyable for you. But I reviewed Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, and I really wound up enjoying the original game. I think it's great. It's a very flawed game, mind you, but it had a really ambitious set of ideas that clearly weren't fully realized. So the hope for the sequel is that that is what would happen. Those ideas would be fully realized. But reality is that is not what happened. Dragon's Dogma 2 is really just a slightly worse version of the original with better graphics. Rather than expand on those systems and flesh them out, most of them were simply reduced. You get less skills overall. The enemy types are essentially the same. Hardly anything is really new. The story, which was already bad in the first game, manages to be just as bad here, and while they set it up really well with an interesting start, it, then once you get to the second area of the game becomes essentially nothing, and suddenly you're thrown into the end with barely any explanation at all and quests that don't even make a ton of sense. Which leaves me with how I feel about the game, and that is that Dragon's Dogma 2 as a standalone title is fine. It's a pretty good action game with some fun moments and combat, but as a sequel, it's honestly worse than the original in a lot of ways. In fact, I would go so far as to say, and I believe I mentioned this in my review, this feels more like a remaster to the original where they trimmed features rather than a full standalone title. And for me, that was incredibly disappointing after how much I loved the original title. But again, to be honest, if I had played this one first and didn't know about the original, I probably would have enjoyed it more. Which makes perfect sense to me then that this game got the very mixed reviews that it did. But I think that is where we're going to wrap up this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. And while I generally try to keep things pretty positive around here, I do think it's important to mention, at least here and there, that there are games that I think failed to deliver, and that's worth discussing, at least in some form or fashion. With that in mind, if you'd like to tell me about games that you either found disappointing or games you actually just really enjoyed this year or were better than you expected even, I'd be happy to hear about it down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.